and welcome back to another episode of the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show, the show where we talk about all the crazy stupid stuff that people do in marketing and how you cannot do that, but instead can do smart, meaningful things with your marketing time, including the things that you measure, which is our wonderful theme for today. We're going to be talking about measuring what matters in marketing. And if you are not new to the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show, you might be thinking, Tracy, you've done an episode before on measuring things. And you're right, I have done an episode before on measuring things, but yet still people do crazy, stupid stuff when it comes to measuring things in marketing. And so alas, we have another conversation. And this time we get a whole panel of experts in this arena who are going to be giving us some great insights, feedback, knowledge, perspective on what we can look at, what questions we can ask that will allow us to actually measure what matters for our business and how we can get our business to the goals we have set for it. If you are joining us live, and most of you will not take me up on this because most of you don't ever take me up on this, but there's this fancy little comments space here. We would love to know that you're here, and we would love to hear what are specific challenges that you are having in measuring your marketing, effectiveness, ROI, all the good stuff that's going to come up in the conversation, or any specific wins that you've had, because this is an opportunity for us all to inform each other and learn together. So if you are here, we would love to hear your voice in the conversation. And with your voice, we also have some lovely panelists who are joining us today. And there's like so much robust knowledge in the measurement arena here. I'm super excited for this panel. So would you like to meet them? I think we should meet all of our panelists. Before we get started, because I always forget to say this, I'm Tracy Borreson. I am your host today, host of the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show. Also, I have been in and around some smart marketing measurements and some really not smart marketing measurements over my time in the marketing arena. So I will have some experience to share today. But let's get to the panelists, because these guys have, I should add this up on the panelist episodes, like how many years of experience are on the panel, because I think it would surprise
We don't
people.
want to talk about that.
No, Stuart has 100 years.
We don't want to talk about that. I'm only 21, so I only have like 1 year of marketing experience, Tracy. I just learned a lot in that last year.
You can have a very impactful year. This is true.
You can. I'm only 21 in a few months. It's just I haven't counted the months in a while.
It's like when kids are small and you count how old they are in months. Yeah, this is how many months of marketing experience you have on this panel today. No, but in all honesty, we have some amazing brains with us today. So let's learn a little bit more about who they are. I'm going to come to you guys in the order that you came into the studio. So you know what that is. Paula, coming to you first. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why measuring what matters to you.
Sure. So my name is Paula Skaper. I'm a management consultant. I have a firm called 33 Dolphins Growth Strategy. I'm in Western Canada. And I have spent 20 some years working with CEOs specifically around sales and marketing and aligning strategic decision-making with business goals, sales and marketing strategies. So measurement is a big part of it. The reason that measuring what matters to me is because if you measure the wrong thing, you might make a poor decision based on what ultimately turns out to be misinformation. And we'll talk about what I mean by that later.
Oh, so much misinformation when there's so much data available. Awesome. Always a pleasure to have you, Paula. And Stuart.
Yeah, hi, I'm Stuart Webb. I'm a little bit further east than Western Canada, although I've enjoyed some time in Eastern Canada. So I'm sort of in the middle of the UK right at the moment, where it is well into the autumn or fall season, as you might call it. And it's got very cold and very wet in the last couple of days, which has been really unpleasant. What's my history? Well, I call myself the scientific business value builder, and that's basically because I was a scientist. And as you know, scientists measure absolutely everything. But I was a scientist for about, I don't want to say how many years before I eventually started out in my journey of sort of building and starting businesses. And one of the things that I discovered early on in that business building career was I needed to take a lot of those scientific principles that I learned as I'd like to say young scientist, but I was in my 30s when I finished that career, so not that young. But I took a lot of those principles of what I'd learned, which is where you measure. If you measure the right thing, you can actually interpret the data properly and make the right decision about what you do with that data. And so I absolutely agree with you, Paula. So many people measure stuff and then make a decision based upon what they've measured, but they've measured the wrong thing, or they've measured it in the wrong way, which is worse, and asked the wrong question. And I think that's the key thing that I think about measuring now, is what's the question you are asking, because that drives the data you're gathering and the answer that you're going to get from that data. And so many people are asking the wrong question. And I can talk for hours about my experience of using some techniques about that. But for me, a lot of people are currently asking all the wrong questions, and they're getting lots and lots of answers, but none of those answers are making sense and helping them make the right decisions. So we'll talk in more detail about that, I'm sure, Tracy.
Oh, yes, absolutely we will. And this actually reminds me of the conversation I had with Mark yesterday about asking good questions. So Mark, tell us a little bit about you and why measuring what matters.
Well, I mean, roughly 20 years ago, I was probably a marketer, a senior marketing leader in large companies, not altogether different than anyone else. But I was working for then CEO of HP, a guy named Mark Hurd, who basically really put the heat on all of us to show marketing's value. And so I went on a trek, so to speak, for the next 15 years to figure out exactly how I would take existing math, like regression, for example, right, and translate that into an operating system that could scale and could deliver insights. And so by the time I was CMO of Honeywell Aerospace, where we did this at scale on a global basis, I was probably circa 2012. I was probably one of 3 B2B CMOs that could actually say that we'd stitched it all together and could present a cohesive portrait of how we impacted more deals, bigger deals, and faster time to close for the business at not only at the global level, but any market that we were in. So when you do that kind of work, right, it's necessarily self-interested. But then at a certain point, you get to a level of maturity where you realize that there's actually a structural set of problems below what you're working on. And as far as this is concerned, this goes beyond marketing and go-to-market. This is really about operationalizing analytics at the clock speed of the business. And part of that is latency issues, conquering the latency issues, scalability issues, certainly cost issues. I was spending $9 or $10 million a year at Honeywell just on analytics, and it was mainly because of all the people we had to hire. But it's also about understandability, because you can literally do every other part of this equation correctly, and if no one in the business knows how to make a better decision as a result of your work, right, it's all for naught. It's just a total bust, right? So that ultimately, those realizations led us to create Proof Analytics, which is a causal analytics software company.
And I'm sure there's going to be some more things that come up in the conversation around that today. And I had my demo of Proof Analytics yesterday, so I got to see behind the scenes. Very cool for anybody who's looking at marketing analytics. Just call Mark and have a demo. It's worth it. Okay, I want to start with this concept of asking the right question, though, because I feel like in a world of data where, there's there's data about everything, right? And Mark, one of the things we talked about was even just like how AI can synthesize data, and like there's a lot of data out there. So before we get to the data component, let's talk about asking the right questions. So who wants to start with some of the things? I want to start with the wrong questions. How can we identify what the wrong questions are?
The wrong question is anything that begins with data. Right?
That's a good way to look at it.
Actually, you start at the other end of the spectrum, right? And you start with the business questions that people really want to know the answers to, most of which, by its very nature, are causal, right? And that then suggests an analytics framework, let's call it that, right? That says, okay, if we're going to answer the relationship issues, questions related to this, right, we're going to need the following types of data. It's almost like a recipe card, right? If you're going to make this dish, you need these ingredients before you can begin to combine them together. And I think that is the missing step for a lot of companies that we work with, is a logic step. And they tend to gravitate to a data first strategy because from a process perspective, that's understandable, but not from a logic perspective. It's inverted, right? And I'd say that the other thing to really keep in mind all the time is that as important as data is, I mean, it's crucially important. It's essentially a proto asset, right? It's always and only about the past. And you cannot extrapolate accurate off of data. You can't stare at even beautiful data visualizations and figure out what's going to happen next.
Yeah, you're right, Mark. An awful lot of data that we gather allows us to steer a business by staring in the rearview mirror. We're not looking through the windscreen at what's going to happen. We're looking at what we've done and how we've course corrected, and then going, well, okay, we're now going in this direction. Is that the right direction? We'll find out later. And that's a really bad way of doing it. I think, Mark, what you were highlighting was, and this is something I've done a lot with businesses that I've run and businesses that I've been involved in running and companies that I'm helping to the founder to run now. They do an awful lot of, well, we need to understand this. So let's just try and find out something that we've already got in our mass data that we've collected and see if that will tell us. And so often what they've forgotten is that if this is the direction we want to take, then what we need to do is say, okay, that's a direction, but there's got to be some way of understanding that we're on course for that. And we start collecting the data and use that to keep us aligned with that direction. And one of the things that I really sort of think that too few businesses do in their very early stages is they set themselves what I call a North Star metric, the one number, the one thing that they can look at and keep themselves aligned. And the thing that they fail to do is start measuring that early. They measure lots of things, none of which tell them anything, but they then use that. And this is where we come to the question. They then use that, as Mark was saying, they then use that and say, well, we've got a measure of the number of clicks on our website. So we're going to use that and we're going to drive that up. And that's great. But unless you've got an effective call to action and that call to action aligns with the business strategy of what you want the person that's on the website to do, it doesn't tell you anything. But a lot of people get very excited because they've got an increase in a number and they go, that proves, and it doesn't. It's back to that sort of, just because when it starts raining, lots of people put up an umbrella doesn't mean that putting up the umbrella will cause it to rain. It's not cause and effect. It may be a correlation, but that doesn't tell you anything. And that's where I often find people saying things like, we've measured a such and such increase, and you go, okay, well, what does that mean? How does that tell you what you're looking for?
I think sometimes what happens, actually a lot of times what happens, is that the question being asked is a question that has a yes/no answer. And any reasonable data scientist, when it comes to marketing, can interpret data in multiple different ways. So, often a client will show me something that's happening on their website, and is this happening because of, or is this indication that? And they're looking for a certainty, a yes, no answer, when in reality, the answer is often, well, possibly. Here are some things, and we need to look at some other metrics to figure out what that might be. There's a gentleman from your neck of the woods, actually, Stuart, whose writings and I really enjoy. His name is Rory Sutherland. And he has a story that he tells, a parable that he tells about the coffee shop. So I don't know about you all, but I like to go for a nice latte in a nice coffee shop. Well, coffee shops have been closing earlier and earlier. And sometimes now in parts of Vancouver, 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the afternoon, 3:45, they're closed. The door is closed, everything's, and it, because, why? Well, we don't sell coffee after 4 p.m. He tells a story of, well, what happens at 3:30 in the afternoon when the store is closing at 4 and the staff is only paid until 4:10 or 4:15. They clean up the tables, they put the chairs upside down, they bring everything inside because they want to be out that door as quick as possible. They start putting the bakeries away. Well, what do you feel when you walk into a place like that? Right? If all you're looking at is the data of sales, do we sell coffee after 4? And the answer is no. If no one's asking, why don't we sell coffee after 4? What would we need to do to sell coffee after 4? What do people want? Like, those are the good questions. And often I think as business people, we get too attached to the revenue number and think that the revenue number is actually the answer to everything. It's not. It's the byproduct of everything.
Right. Yeah.
And ultimately, if it's going up, we're happy. If the profit's going up with it, but it's a not a leading indicator. It's a lagging indicator. And if we're only looking in the rearview mirror when we look at that.
So much of business thinking is evidence of a desire to live in a deterministic world, right? Where you create a machine, almost like a vending machine, and you put certain things in and you're guaranteed every time to get the same things out. Kind of like the law of gravity. You take 100 rocks up to the top of a building, you throw them off, you're not going to find any of them floating in the air, right? They're all going to hit the ground. But the reality is that outside of a few things like that, we live in a very probabilistic world. And the business decision is about understanding why things happen to the best of our ability anyway, and making a better and better and better bet. And the ultimate goal is to ultimately trigger the law of compounding. Because if you keep making better and better and better bets frequently enough, that's exactly what happens. And so it's just I totally agree with you, Paula. I mean, I think that is, that deterministic mindset has done more to foreclose selling more lattes after 4 o'clock than we can possibly imagine, right? It's a huge issue, and it's not the question that you have to be asking is more about why, what, and how than yes or no.
I think the story about the coffee shop's really interesting. It reminds me of a discussion I had with somebody who wanted to know how they should measure the effectiveness of the reception staff, because they didn't really produce anything that they could actually sort of, capture and think about. And the one thing that I said was measure the number of smiles they get, because the smile is a way of welcoming people into the building. And if they're smiling a lot, you're going to get people feel better about entering into your building. And they went, that's a ridiculous thing to measure. And I went, why? It's directly related to how you want the staff to be. That is welcoming. And you don't welcome somebody with a frown. You welcome somebody with a smile. So sit down in the reception area with a stopwatch and count how many times they smile in 5 minutes, and give them the feedback and say, we'd like you to smile 2, 3, 4, 5 times more than you were in the last 5 minutes, and actually sort of incentivize them with the behavior that drives the result that you want. And I think we go back to the coffee shop and ask the question, what are we incentivizing there? We're incentivizing the staff to be finished by 4 o'clock. In fact, we should be saying we incentivize you to make your last sale at 4:03. And then, then it's time to clear up. But we should be incentivizing people to go to the thing that we know will drive the best result for customers. So, with the example of the receptionist, I remember the manager sat down with the reception staff and said, I'm going to be measuring how many times you smile. And they were frightened, and they said, well, what would you like us to do? Sometimes we don't feel like smiling. And the answer was, I'd kind of like you to just force it. So sometimes we have to push people into that space. We have to start looking at things that make them uncomfortable and measuring what we actually know will be a good result, even if it's not comfortable.
And interesting too, because there's always, like, even in the correlation and the causality conversation, right? I think one of the things that a lot of people understand from a smiling perspective is that when you smile, you feel better. Right? Even if you didn't feel like smiling before, if you do smile, then you might feel like smiling after. So it's interesting. And I mean, I don't know, I personally love the whole concept of bringing more smiles to the world. But I want to talk about the version of the questions and, like, how do we make them your question? So let's keep going with the coffee shop example here. Why does the coffee shop care that they're not selling coffee after 4 o'clock? Right? Like, if your business question is, how can we sell coffee after 4 o'clock? Right? Well, there's probably shift worker people that really want coffee after 4 o'clock. There might be people there. So, like, how do we take this concept of a quote unquote good question and translate it into your question, the questions that are meaningful for your business?
Well, a few of them are going to be things like the difference between effectiveness and efficiency, right?
I love that one.
And so when you have employees cleaning up early so that they can leave promptly, they are being very efficient in their own interest. And it's costing the restaurant effectiveness in terms of sales, right? And it's perfectly understandable, I think, that a restaurant over time that sees revenue disappear after 4 o'clock, right, is going to say, we need to control as many of our variable costs after 4 o'clock as possible, right? Can't really do anything about the pro rata on the rent, but we can stop paying people, right, to be there. And so it becomes a little bit of a vicious circle. And it's one of those things where in all of the analytic work that we do, we see precious little new stuff. And what I mean by that is the business questions that need to be modeled are remarkably similar, particularly, say, the top 20, right? They all have variations, right? Because we're talking about individual businesses in different situations. But the fundamental question is always like, we want to understand the impact that everything we're doing in go-to-market has on revenue growth, net of time lag and net of external headwinds and tailwinds. I mean, that's kind of a classic. And then they do the same exact model on margin growth, and they do it again on sales velocity, which is.
But Mark, what would you say? And I'd love to hear the other panelists on this side too, because I think all of us have probably seen these, like, kind of foundational questions that we can ask from a business perspective that are going to show value or not show value.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, like, personally, I experience a lot of people who are asking the question because they found that question on a list of questions they asked AI to give them. And so now they're asking them as just a list of questions to ask, but they don't have that like business connection, like why
Right.
I actually want to know the answer to that question. So how do we, knowing that probably a lot of the foundational questions are going to be the same, what is an additional step that people should be looking at in terms of their like connection to the answer?
So, I mean, there's that old story, right, from the movie about sell me this pen, right? The average CEO and CFO are looking at the marketing team or anyone else that's part of go-to-market and saying, sell me this pen. Tell me why you exist. What do I need you for? What do you do? What's your contribution? Right? That's why they have a direct self-interest in making sure that they have the right answer. That's why it's not just a question on a flashcard that they got handed by somebody. It's real life. And it's one of the main reasons why, unfortunately, in the B2B space, marketers are the ultimate C-suite meme, right? I mean, in working on my book and interviewing all these CEOs and CFOs about go-to-market, you hear a lot of them. And some of them are just like, you're just sitting there going, wow, that is A, really mean, and B, hard to argue. Right? And
Well, and
so,
I think,
yeah,
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Paula, because like from the growth strategy perspective, right? I think a lot of times marketing gets an easy out from that, right? And
I wouldn't
it's
say
pretty
marketing
obvious.
gets an easy out. I
No?
wouldn't say no by no stretch of the because look, when a company wants to grow, they go to marketing and they say, sales are down. We want to grow. What are you going to do about it? The sales team needs more leads. We need different product. We need whatever. What are you going to do about it? When the sales go up, sales points to, oh, look at our closing rates have increased by 20%. Oh, look at, we've generated this much incremental revenue. And marketing gets, well, what did you do to contribute to that? Show me the numbers. And I think the challenge that marketers struggle against is that effective marketing is a multiplier. Effective marketing improves the results that other departments are measuring. And what we're doing, I mean, we're measuring how many people clicked on a website. Well, that doesn't mean anything, frankly. Those people could be competitors. Those people could be kids in a high school science class trying to perform an experiment. We don't know anything about them, but that's what we do. And that's where marketing struggles. We've lost the concept of measuring for lift.
That's so true. You just totally nailed it. I mean, marketing is a nonlinear multiplier. It's not the only one in a business either, right? Interestingly enough, it's the nonlinear functions that struggle the most in showing their value. It's the reason why in B2B, so many companies thought that if they crammed marketing, not that they really ever understood that it's a multiplier function, but nevertheless, if they forced marketing into a linear perspective, very similar to sales, essentially just adjoining themselves to the sales funnel, right? Then somehow this would all come clear, right? But the problem is that the only way to do that is with the kind of demand gen, in quotes, that we've seen for the last 15 years that has been spectacularly ineffective. And it ignores this nonlinear multiplier piece, right? And it's just, I mean, it's one of those situations where the dysfunction is incredibly co-owned. It's not just the marketer's fault at all, but generalists learn from specialists typically in a company. And so if you're a CEO and a CFO and you're wanting to understand marketing, who do you go to? You go to your marketers. And if your marketers are completely unaware of nonlinearity, right, then, or time lag, the fact that time lag can be specifically calculated, things like that, and the criticality of knowing the lag, if they don't know that, bad things are going to happen.
So just as an example for some of our listeners, we're talking about this concept of marketing not being linear. Would someone like to give an example of what that looks like?
Sure. I mean, if I go to my CRO and I say, guess what, in 2025, I'm doubling your revenue goal. Okay. The first conversation that I'm going to have right after I say that is a conversation about how do we double the size of the sales team, right? Because the target is distributed pro rata across a certain number of people. And so there's always a linearity of cost versus revenue that is almost perfectly tracking all the way through, no matter how far you go in your revenue growth, right? That's going in B2B, and it's going to be that way. Not the same thing with marketing, right? If I double the goal, I might have to increase marketing spend 25, 30%, something in that category, because it's not assigned pro rata by the number of marketers or even pro rata by the amount of spend, right? Its effectiveness and its efficiency are mapped on what's called an S curve, right? It's an efficiency curve, but it's more than that. It shows the effectiveness of something right up until the point where you hit the point of diminishing returns, right? Past which you can't, the ground is saturated, you can't, anything else that you pour on the ground is just gonna run off. So this is one of those things where there are rules. I mean, Stuart, I'm sure Paula knows this too, but Stuart, as a scientist, he totally understands, right, that there are rules. There are rules of evidence. There are rules of math. You can't just shortcut stuff just because you'd like a faster, easier answer. And I think that's a big part of kind of the come to Jesus moment that we're all seeing happen right here in B2B.
And you see that, Tracy, think about it. I was going to say, you see that a lot in best practices. What's the best time to post on LinkedIn? Oh, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, between 10 a.m. and noon. So what happens? Everybody and their dog posts between Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, between 10 a.m. and diminishing returns. What's the best time to send email? Monday at 9 a.m. Nope. Totally. Now right. So every time you hit a best practice, it saturates the market and then it no longer works.
Amen. I love that.
This needs to be in like an image somewhere, which is why I'm writing it down.
and hey, that brings us back to the fact that some of the marketing strategies which have got really maxed out now means that we got to return to ones that we have all ignored and decided are old. One of the things that's getting responses now, people sending letters, because letters are no longer used by marketers, and no businesses are sending letters, and the ones that start doing it get a novelty factor. And what will happen? Everybody will return to letters. Email will fall off. You'll get a whole growth in letter sending until you reach that maxed out point again. But that is the cycle. We have to. Mark said it. There's very little new in business to a large extent. We got to accept that the nimble business looks around and does the sort of environment scan and says, okay, what's going on? What is my competitor doing? I've got to do something different. And if that means going back to an old strategy, which worked, but has become less effective because everybody else is now doing it, why not? It's back down to that question we've got to ask. We've got to ask the right question. You shouldn't be asking, what's the new thing? You should be saying, what's the efficient thing? We go back to the efficiency thing that Mark was talking about. You know, I worry an awful lot about, you know, I was working with a team recently. A founder brought in a bunch of new people, and they were trying to be really efficient with their time. But the fact of the matter is they weren't being effective. They were firing emails, and those emails were just being ignored. And they were going, well, I've done what I need to do, but nobody else around here is doing what they need to do. That's not efficient. That's being very efficient, but not being effective. You've got to go back to ask the question, how do I be effective?
That's right.
And is this, but I also feel like maybe specifically from like a junior marketer role, but because we've like created so many things that we're expecting marketers to do, that we don't even have the time, or maybe it's that people don't have the skills to ask the question about like, okay, like I can be honest, I'm being very efficient, but I am not seeing any benefit on the P&L statement here.
There's a great technique, which I think is, once again, it's one of those things that too many people haven't done. Paula sort of alluded to it earlier. You know, when asking the question, why is something happening, we tend to stop too early. And we should ask that question, why, about 5 times to get to the real root cause. You know, learning how to get to the root cause of an issue is so important. So often people will go, why are we finding that we've got an increase in our click rate? Oh, it's because of this. And they immediately leap into solving that problem. What they should be doing is saying, okay, what's causing and driving that? Okay, now we understand that. Why is that happening? And you've got to ask that question at least 5 times to get to the root cause. Once you go to the root cause, then you can start addressing it. But so often we get to the first thing which we cling on to. It's a bit like, you know, Rose and whatever his name was on the Titanic. You know, there's the bit of wood. They've got to the piece of wood and they're going to cling on to it. It doesn't necessarily save your life. You could still find yourself freezing in the water. So, you know, you've got to ask the question why and get to the root cause, and then really get into the lifeboat, rather than grabbing hold of the first piece of wood you see and just floating there and hoping everything will be all right. It really is about driving down to what's the root cause of these things to truly be effective. Because too often we stop too early and then just go, I've got an answer, that'll do, and I can move on that. And too often we come back to, are you asking the right question? If you've not asked the right question, you will arrive at an answer, but it may be the wrong answer. Then you start measuring and you drive yourself in the wrong direction.
I totally.
And the other thing that happens too.
Go ahead, Paul.
I was just saying the other thing that happens too, I think, Stuart, is to Mark's point, when marketers are in this fight for survival, justify your existence, then the answer that is being looked at, there is a personal bias. How can I answer this question in a way that doesn't damage my value to the organization? So we're looking for answers from a bias perspective, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. You know, and I think that comes back to, you know, Mark was talking about it earlier. You know, when the CFO or the CEO starts asking questions, you know, if they're not in, if you haven't created, I mean, you know, we could get into the sort of the business ethics of this, but if you haven't created a space where you can allow people to experiment and fail, if you're constantly looking for the sort of how do we punish those people for getting it wrong or whatever, we have to create the environment where people can explore and experiment and get the time they need to really ask the question. It's when you're asked that question and you're under pressure to answer it quickly, you start asking and answering the wrong questions.
That's true. I think that it's also really important to, as we've already noted, right, how human this is, and that it goes way beyond any particular function. Great example of this right now, this is happening right now, it started happening 2 years ago with the interest rate situation, is that businesses turned around to their data science teams and said, hey, we know you've been doing all kinds of really cool stuff for the last 7 years. We've been paying your bills, right? And we really need help now. We need to, some insight into how we can make better decisions, given all the variabilities that are accosting us in the marketplace. And in too many situations, the data science team said, sorry, not ready yet, still working on data management. To which the response was essentially, F you, right? And what happens in so many cases is that we fall in love with activity.
Don't we just?
Right? And we do not focus on adding value, and we do not focus on our effectiveness. And so what is happening right now in data science is actually very much like what happened 20 some odd years ago with IT. It's being moved under finance and probably will stay there for some years. And it's not because finance thinks that it knows data science better than data science does, but it is a desire to say, we're going to create a business first culture in data science. And when you hear a CEO or CFO talk about subordinating marketing to sales, for example, that's a similar impulse, right? And so part of the issue, I think, that we're also grappling with here, and it's not a fun one at all, is that there's a tremendous amount of ignorance within B2B about marketing and about how to understand its value and what the rules are. And it stands in stark contrast to B2C in this regard. B2C spends a ton of money on market research and a ton of money on analytics. It controls the 4 Ps, and it has more than a passing acquaintance with the P&L, right? Almost none of those things are true in B2B. And so when you see people, for example, say, oh, I've got MTA, right? I now have attribution. And yet they don't understand the technology beneath MTA, and they don't understand what attribution actually really is, right? That it's indivisible from causality, or if you want to be technical about it, causal inference, right? And so they're just willy-nilly breaking all kinds of rules all over the place, usually not even realizing that they're doing it, right? But it damages their cred immensely. And that's one of the things that's got to stop. It's a lot easier in some respects to stop doing things you shouldn't be doing than it is to start doing things you should be.
I think that's true. It is very, very difficult for people to stop doing something because it becomes a talisman. It becomes something they hang on to.
That's right.
You know, we've always done it this way. It's one of the things I hear an awful lot. You know, we've always done. I mean, just, you know, I was having a meeting with a sales manager about his meetings, and I was asking how effective the meetings were. And he said, well, they're absolutely brilliant. We get results every week. And I go, okay, show me the results that you get from your meetings. And it became very obvious very quickly that actually he wasn't really measuring the effectiveness of the meetings. He was measuring action points that were coming out of the meetings, and he used that as a measure. And I said, I think you should stop these meetings because I don't think you know why you're having the meetings. Oh, we've always had meetings. Yeah, I know you've always had meetings, but are they the right meetings, and are they the meetings that are having the effect that you want them to have in terms of driving the sales teams to produce better results? I get results. You know, the problem is this was something that they had always done. And it was very difficult to actually sort of see any link between what the sales teams actually achieved effectively than what the meetings were trying to do. Now, the person that set these meetings up had a very clear idea of what they wanted to do with these meetings. And the thing that they had forgotten was that the meetings were there to address the follow-up, which they knew was a key driver of a more effective sales process. And that's what the meeting initially had started to do. It was addressing one particular issue. But unfortunately, that was some years back. That sales manager had moved on because they'd been effective and they'd done what they needed to do. They'd driven up that process to the fact that it was now it was an efficient and effective process. So he got promoted. New sales manager comes in and takes over the meeting, doesn't know why they're there, and just carries on with the meeting. Unfortunately, the correlation between the follow-up, which was the initial focus of the meeting, had been lost. But they believed that because they had the meeting, they were getting a result. It comes back to, human beings are really bad at actually sitting down and understanding patterns. We don't see patterns in data properly. And even data scientists struggle sometimes with patterns in data. My research many years ago involved me having to rethink how I interpreted stuff. And it took me a long time to understand that actually what you have to do is stop believing sometimes your own theory, because actually you have to, sometimes you do an experiment and you get a result. And the first thing you do is, well, must have done it wrong. It happened to me in my scientific career. I did an experiment, I got a result, and I took it to my supervisor, and they said, well, you must have done something wrong because that's not the result I expected. To which my answer was, I did the experiment right. It's a clean result. All I can do is do the experiment and then come up with a theory to explain it, not the other way around. Now, we had a bit of a battle about that, but it taught me something that I've taken into the business context, which is you do an experiment, you get a result. You don't ask the question, is that right or wrong? You say, now I understand something, I can build my next experiment. And that's the way you build an effective process.
Well, and I heard something once about the concept of like the scientific method, right? In terms of like, you need to have done things as part of the process to prove your theory wrong. If you're not actively trying to prove your theory wrong, you won't actually know if it's right. It comes back to that bias. I'm going into this assuming it's right. I construct the experiment to prove that it's right. And then you're like, what did I really learn?
Then you've got peer review, which is guaranteed to shoot you full of holes.
Right. Well, I mean, and that's kind of good, right? But then it also makes me come back to, because one of the things I heard in your share there, Stuart, is this concept of ego. Right. And when we're looking at data and we're looking at metrics, we do have the possibility to see things that we haven't seen because we can't process that pattern, or we haven't seen it presented that way before. But a lot of times ego is what keeps us stuck. Yeah. So, and Paul, I'd love to hear your perspective on this from a growth perspective, because I do feel like ego is a limiting factor for growth in a lot of scenarios. And so what would you say is the relationship between data and ego, and the combination of those two things equaling or not equaling growth?
So I prefer to call it bias.
Okay.
Than ego. Just because we've got, we're talking about human beings, and there's so much emotion attached to saying, well, your ego is in the way, right?
Well, but and to confirm, we all have an ego, right? We can't get rid of our ego. It's part of identity. So we won't ever get rid of it. But yes, let's call it bias for the sake of this.
So let's call it bias. And it's really our lived experience, what we've experienced in the past, what we've been told, what we've heard, what happens at the, CEO bar where we're all sitting around talking about what's going on in our business, and the common wisdom, right? It's that unverified data that we accept as truth that then influences how we interpret data. So I think that's part of it. Is a lot of my work with, because I work a lot with CEOs of small, medium enterprise businesses, right? So they're growing, and they're I've never had a client that had $10 million to spend on analytics. I'd probably, be in heaven. It's just not something that's feasible for most businesses, right? So they're trying to figure out, how do I interpret this limited data set that I have, using all these best practices without actually having the ability to gather the data set that they need. And a great example, a couple of clients, companies that I've worked with, they're starting up. They got a brand new product, right? And they want to do an ICP. They want to figure out who their ICP is. And they'll say things like, oh, I don't really feel like we have the data to be confident in our ICP. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend a whole bunch of money on SEO. And I'm going to spend a whole bunch of money on paid ads. And I'm going to spend a whole bunch of money on paid lead generation. And then I'm going to see who responds to those messages. And then that's going to be my ICP.
Jeez.
Mhm.
Yeah.
This is not uncommon, folks.
Yeah.
There might be people watching today who
There's sort of
tried that
there's a
strategy.
logic gap there that's fairly monumental, but yeah.
Yeah, but in the absence of, right, so it's this, I think we don't, number one, I don't think we teach the scientific method effectively enough to kids in high school, which is where they need to start, because it applies to not just marketing, it applies to life, right? You go into a situation you don't know, which is every morning for a marketer. You're innocent. You have to come up with, first of all, an educated guess. Here's what I think might happen. Now, how do I prove that is or isn't true? How do I find out if that is or isn't true? Then you go look at that data. But if you're just throwing spaghetti at the wall,
Right.
well, if you don't have a plan for why you're throwing it or which wall you're throwing it against, you're going to be in some trouble. And so you get people making decisions like the coffee shop owner who shuts down an hour early to manage costs and improve profit, not realizing that if they just got their staff to close up shop after 4 p.m., they could sell probably so much that they'd find they were closing at 4:30, monumentally increasing their profits, contributing much more against their sunk cost of their rent. And they don't think about it because nobody buys coffee after 4 p.m.
Yeah.
Well, in
Well,
that
as a
example,
trained scientist, as a trained scientist, Paula, I wish more people were taught the scientific method. But I'll make my pitch to the education centre later, Tracy.
One of the best things I've ever heard on this. So I have a mentor that is a pretty well within a certain world. He's a pretty well-known physicist, right? And this is like 10 years ago. And he said, Mark, he goes, I can tell that you know a lot and that you're actually kind of proud of the fact that you know a lot. He said, but I want you to start thinking about everything you don't know, right? And then I want you to think about something that none of us can quantify, none of us can qualify. That is all the unknown unknowns. And he said, and then I want you to realize that whatever it is that you know is such a small part of all of that, right? That he said, I want you to do something. I want you to start using your knowledge, whatever you have, to curate your ignorance. And I found that to be profound, right? Because it always, like, occasionally you luck out. Both you guys know this, right? You hit an epiphany, you have an epiphany, right? This is something that was not on your radar. You did not understand 2 seconds before, and all of a sudden, bing, right? And then right after the exaltation of that, you immediately slip, if you're like me anyway, you immediately slip into recrimination about why you didn't know that sooner, right? And that is what that has given me over time is a posture of humility in all this that actually has increased the number of insights and epiphanies that I get from the numbers, right? Because I'm fundamentally not trying to prove that I'm right anymore. I am on the search for more understanding that I currently do not have.
Mark, there's a profound insight into that, in that you I think you've identified what marketers have to do. They have to acknowledge that they don't necessarily know the answer, but they are trying to run some experiments to get more information in order to drive better results. But we identified earlier the problems that most marketers have is the CFO, the CEO are not giving them the time, the space, and allowing them to do the right experiments to actually drive better results, because they're under pressure to prove the point. And so they're never given the opportunity to have those epiphanies, to have those moments when they actually can turn around and say, at long last, I've got the answer. If we say this, this, and this, in this order, in this way, in the right circumstance, that will truly drive results. We've not given people the time to make those experiments and actually prove it. You know, I'm a living example of somebody who sort of blundered my way to growing businesses. And I can promise you, I never got the marketing right on any of it. It was always horrendous. We were just blundering around in the dark, trying to make things happen. And we got there. But 90% of the time, could I look back and say, that was the magic switch? No. I spent half my life trying to pull different growth levers and wondering which one actually did it. I then started to apply what I'd learned as a scientist. Pull one growth lever at a time, find out what happens. If it doesn't work, put that one back, pull another one, and then do it. But I gave myself the time because I happened to be the CEO. I was allowing myself. If I'm working for the CEO and I'm saying, look, wait a minute, boss, I've got 3 levers. I've got to pull one at a time, and I've got to give time for the experiment, for the ship to turn before we know what's happening. They're not going to give me that time.
But I think also, you know, Stuart, you're 100% nailing it on that. I think also, if any one of the 3 of us was in a room with the CEO and they said, we want you to try this and we want to know by tomorrow at noon, all 3 of us would have a good giggle and then say, okay, now really, right? There's a youth culture around marketing that has come with the advent of digital marketing, where we bring people in and we think if they can turn on a computer, they can effectively use Facebook, they've got a good TikTok following, that we presume they can do marketing. And so you get people coming into the field that, and I didn't start in marketing. I don't think any 3 of us actually started in marketing, but I had mentors. I'm sure you had. But you get people coming into the field now, straight out of school. You know, the ink's not dry on their diploma, and they're director of marketing for some company and expected to do execution and tactics, and they're running, and they don't really have the context or the business background or the experience yet to be able to hold that line firm. I have a client just recently was doing some work with one of the channels and was testing things, and we had our regular kind of get together, here's what I'm doing. And he was like, okay, so on Monday I made this change, and then that wasn't making a thing. So in the afternoon I made this change, and then I did this, and then I did that. And I said to him, how many changes did you make in the last 7 days since we spoke? He'd made 7 or 8 different changes. And I said, great. How do you know which one's causing this stuff that's happening now? You can't. But we don't teach people that. We don't teach them the things they need to know to be effective. And then we run around complaining they're not effective.
No, it's true. I mean, the issue of time lag is a huge component of this. The other thing that I end up talking to CEOs and CFOs about all the time, right, and also marketers, is that it's a mathematical, I hesitate to say rule, okay, but it's something like a rule that 2/3 of a model is stuff that you don't control. It's the externalities, it's the headwinds and the tailwinds and all that kind of stuff, right? And so all of that typically, like when we get a new customer, we onboard them, they begin to build models, they usually do a really good job, except they have no externalities in the model, right? None.
Just because we're not worried about anything like COVID, Mark. We're not.
Right. We're not. Or
that kind of stuff
rates,
doesn't happen.
Or interest rates, or our brand reputation, which is not something we control. It's what our customers control about us. All that kind of competitor action, all kinds of stuff, right? And so these are the headwinds and tailwinds that impact the effectiveness and the efficiency of everything that you do control. And so the question I would have for either one of you, both of you, right, is, do you feel that, and I agree, I want to stipulate this, I really agree that there needs to be psychological safety in the workplace, okay, to be able to get people's best efforts. But how much of this is that if you gave them full safety, they still wouldn't know how to do it, how to build a good experiment?
So I think Paula nailed it earlier, Mark. You can build full safety, psychological safety into an environment, but Paula absolutely nailed it with what she said about the young person that she was mentoring, with the number of changes they were making. Nobody is taught, because for me, and this is an overgeneralization, and at school I was that science geek. I was top of the class in all the science stuff, and that's why I ended up at the universities I did, doing the research I did. So I absorbed it like it was natural. I then come across marketers who dropped out of science at school because they didn't understand it. So they took, and they didn't like math, so they didn't do that very well either.
Right.
And now they're in marketing because they were told it was all about talking and writing, and they're good at that. So the first thing, you sit down with them and say, okay, so how are we going to measure this? And the first thing you have to explain is, what do we mean by measure? Because that's the concept they still haven't got. We were talking about that. And so you start by saying, well, we're going to measure this. What do we mean by measure? You were talking about it earlier, Mark. They go, oh, at long last, I've got access to the numbers. Okay, what do those numbers tell you? I don't even understand numbers. I don't understand what numbers mean. Mm-hmm. So we've got to start back at that, which is where we've got to teach people now. People coming out of, they come out of school with a digital mastery, digital masters in or a master's in digital marketing or something. And the first thing you say is, okay, so do you know exactly how to run an experiment? Oh yeah, we've been told about A/B testing. Terrific. That's the first test that you should be doing, an A/B test. A/B test everything. How long do you run an A/B test for? What exactly do you change on each A/B? None of that is understood. And the fact of the matter is, it takes until you've got to your sort of level, Mark, where you've been through years and years and years of trying this and learning what doesn't work, that you go, at long last, I've got it. I'm beginning to get it. Kids, we've got to get back to teaching people, how do you run an experiment? What do you do with that result at the end of it? And then what do you do once you've got that result to make your next decision? Not, I've run the experiment, I'm going to make another change and see what happens. Because otherwise, I don't know if any of you have been in a plane where the pilot doesn't actually know what each of the controls does, but they have a tendency to do something called overcorrecting. And somebody is flying a plane for the first time, they pull the stick back, the plane does that, and then it does that, and then it does that, and it's not
I was doing this driving my grandfather's electric wheelchair earlier today. I was like, whoop, nope, that's too far. Whoop, nope, that didn't turn right.
And, I'm sorry to say it, most of the marketing departments I get involved with are doing this with their marketing. They are pulling the stick back, pushing it forward, pulling it back, and they've never got to the stage where the plane is just flying before they make a change. And they are doing, something happened, let's do it again. Let's do another one of those. Mark, you're absolutely right. When you talked about sort of, those plans that you build, the model you build, how many of us stick in that our competitor might decide to invite, to invent something which is a direct competitor of ours, and what that would do to our market plan? Yep. We just don't stick those sort of numbers in, because partly because we don't want to think about it happening. I was working with one element of a telecom supplier on a day when a product was announced called Skype. And you can imagine what that did to that market. It just destroyed their business virtually overnight. And I actually said to the business unit head, I said, did you have this on your risk plan? And he went, we never thought anybody would come up with a product like that. They didn't even want to think about it. That's part of our problem, I think. We kind of don't want to think about some of those because they don't feel good. So, what do we have to do? We have to go back to when you bring somebody to the business. First of all, let's teach them the standard. How do you run an experiment? How do you then interpret that? And go back to what we talked about at the very beginning of this, which is when you're running an experiment, make sure you're asking the right question. Not any old question, but have you got down to the root cause of what it is you think you're trying to test, and then go test that one thing at one time, get a result before you make the next change. And I could get very emotional about this because I could, but it just worries me that we don't do it.
Yeah,
I have a question for the two of you.
Yeah, sure.
We know that, nobody gets into their career and wants to do a lousy job or wants to do it wrong. People are doing the best they can with the knowledge they have, the information they have, and the time they have available to them. And those things are determined at a level typically well above most marketers today that are actually charged with running this thing, right? It's happening in the C-suite, the CEO, sometimes the CMO, sometimes the CSO. How do you have a conversation with the C-suite to get them to the level where they understand what they need to be able to give to their marketing departments in order to create conditions for success? Because it's not just money.
No, it's not. In my particular case, as somebody who actually went through that process at HP, right? I remember I went home one Friday after a particularly tumultuous meeting with Mr. Hurd, and I went out in my garage and I found this box full of old university textbooks, and sure enough, there were math textbooks in there. And I remember reading it with a level of interest that I had never shown in school, and it was a level of interest sparked by a deep-seated need to preserve myself, right?
Yeah.
And so I came back 2 weeks later with the required proposal that set forth a plan of attack, so to speak, on the problem, but also made certain kinds of key dependencies really, really known. Like, for one, at that time in particular, I was not even close to being a data scientist. So I needed some help, like doing the actual stuff, right? I needed some funding, maybe not a lot, but probably, if memory serves, it was like $250,000, right? And Hurd was like, okay, he goes, I'll totally go for that. And he said, and I'll do you one better. He said, I think you also need an education on what's really important to the finance team. And so I'm going to give you 6 weeks worth of intensive mentorship by our CFO, a guy named Bob Wayman, right? And that was probably one of the greatest gifts that I ever received professionally, right? Because it was Wayman cut to the chase. This is what's really important. It was like the ultimate finance for non-financial managers course, right? And so the bottom line is that at the end of the day, I think most CEOs and CFOs, they want to know what they should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that they constantly want to cut. They want to optimize. And because they don't know the answers to the questions around effectiveness, the only way that they can do that is to keep cutting until something breaks. And then they go, oh crap. And then, they kind of reinflate the balloon slightly, to get past that point again. And then they're kind of playing that game, right? It's kind of a little bit of a charades game. And but it's the only way that they know how to solve the problem. And so I think that when you give them a straight up, real deal assessment that actually has broad ramifications, because you're not just evaluating marketing, you're evaluating marketing's impact on sales. And then if you go broader into GTM, you're looking at all the piece parts and how they all work together across an arc of time to either make people want to buy or not buy, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really you're always going to have the occasional butthead, right, in the C-suite, okay? But most of them, they just want success.
Yeah. Do you know, Mark, I think you did actually sort of answer that really nicely. And I don't want to end on a really controversial one, but the one thing that I think that the C-suite don't do enough of is trying to build cohesion as opposed to silos. And I don't know why it is. And Tracy, Paula, you probably got more insight into this, but the more females I find in the C-suite, the more cohesion there is, and the more they're looking at things in a holistic way and less about silos. And if the C-suite could get together and realize, as you said at the beginning, that marketing is a multiplier, and instead of trying to sort of silo it, but encourage it to be part of everything from customer service through to operations. One of the things that really worries me about the number of times I come across marketers who don't know what operations are about, because believe it or not, if they go out and tell the world that they've got a world-class product and what operations delivers is a pile of poop, it's destroyed the marketing message. So the one thing that the marketers really need to understand is what is happening in operations, what's happening in finance, what's happening in product delivery, in their supply chain. They need to have an understanding of all of it because it multiplies everything. And the number of silos that develop are detrimental to that. And I don't know why, but females in the boardroom helped drive greater cohesion and less silos. So maybe we need a few more females in the boardroom. I don't know.
I don't know that Paula and I would disagree.
I think that's the most brilliant thing you've said all day, Stuart.
Absolutely. I think that
Having annoyed every male CEO in the country, I'm going to be getting a lot of phone calls tomorrow and a firing by several of them. I'm going to get out of it at that.
Well, on that note,
rendering it genderless just for a moment, right? One of the things that has been really fascinating to me in working on my book is, so this is my, I interviewed several hundred of Fortune 2000 CEOs and CFOs. The vast majority, did not, when I asked about it, did not have a expansive, rigorous, readily renewable, and widely communicated business strategy, which in turn, all of their functions operationalize in their way, right? And so what happens instead is that the functions, nature abhors a vacuum, right? So what do the functions do? They build a strategy, right? The only problem is people being people, they place themselves at the center of their strategy, right? They are the MVP in their world, right? So if you've got that between marketing and sales, for example, you've got instant political dynamite.
Yep.
Right. And so, it's that lack of cohesion is a real problem. And you only can go to one place to solve it. And that's at C-suite, specifically the CEO.
Yep.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things we've talked about today, and I know when we think about measuring and metrics and data, often we're thinking about numbers and formulas and things of that nature. But in our conversation today, we talked a lot about the human nature of things. And these are things that are relevant when we're talking about measuring what matters. And I think are only ignored to the detriment of the things that we are trying to accomplish. And while I feel like we could continue talking about this for a very long time, because we're already 15 whole minutes over the hour, and I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to get these guys to stop talking. This is where we're going to leave it for today. Although I feel like, and if you guys watch this panel and you're like, I would love to hear more about what this panel would have to say, you let me know and we can get this whole panel back together to keep talking about this, because there are so many things that we have yet to uncover when it comes to measuring what matters. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Paula, Stuart, Mark, thank you so much for all of
Thanks,
your
guys.
insights.
I enjoyed it.
So amazing.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, we try to make it fun here at the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show, even though we talked about a lot of crazy things that people do. And hopefully you are also taking away some things, at very minimally, some questions that you can ask yourself about what could I do to make this more meaningful, to make this matter. Oh, Scott. Hi, Scott, popping in the comments right at the end there. Yes, and I agree with you. Juicy insights were had on this episode today. And I would encourage you to connect. So Scott, connect with Paula, Stuart, Mark, and everybody else who's not watching, or who is watching but didn't say anything in the comments. If you're not watching, you wouldn't know to do it. Connect with these peeps. They have so many ideas, so many questions, so many ideas on how we can incorporate the scientific method, what data can tell us, how to ask good questions, how to make those questions relevant to your growth strategy. A conversation with any one of these peeps is a good use of your time. So please feel free to do that. Have the conversations. And if measuring what matters is something that is very important in your world today, do not let this conversation be the last time you get into the conversation about it. Let it be the first of many times that you get into conversation about it, so that you can actually get to a result of measuring what matters. And with that, everybody, until next time, permission to do you.